And so now it's time to actually start working on our drawers. So as you guys have already seen, I've gone through and rough milled all of our pieces. And when I say rough, it is a very rough milling because I didn't want to go all the way to my exact dimensions because I knew I wasn't going to be able to touch the drawer pieces for a few days. And this is also a really good thing anytime you're doing fine woodworking with wood like this, and especially when you're resawing pieces, like all of our sides and back pieces are all resawed down to just over 5/8 of an inch thick. When you're taking off that much material, your wood pieces are going to move around a lot. And so the fact that these have been sitting for a few days now means that the wood is going to move however much it needs to move, and we're good to now move on to actually doing the final milling of it. And so this is a really good way of working, and it's how you should do most of your fine woodworking. You always want to do a preemptive milling, so you want to get it decently close to the sides, and especially if you're doing any resawing, you want to definitely get it down to that resawed thickness, which is probably usually about a 1/16 to an 1/8 over size, and then you want to leave it for a few days. Okay, so with our pieces all milled up, we can start cutting the rabbets that are going to make our dovetailing a little bit easier. So I've already cut the front ones on these two pieces because I needed to actually get the saw all set up before I wanted to talk about it. So our pieces are all milled to the exact same thickness across all of them. They're super accurate. The drum sander is such a nice way to work to get things to a nice consistent accuracy. That's also, as you can see on the table saw here, is super flat, which is just great. And so what I've gone through and done is on our front where we have the half blind dovetails, they're only going to be a 1/2 inch long. So using my marking gauge, I set it up to at a 1/2 inch of width on there, using a setup block, and then just mark the line all the way around like you normally would with dovetails. And I made sure to do that across all of my pieces on all the front sections, so that I know exactly where the front ends are. And so on the back side, we're going to be using 5/8 through dovetails. And so again, I set up the marking gauge, ran a marking line around it, and again, once we're done with the front end, we'll set up the saw to do the back side. And so on the table saw now, what I've got set up is a 3/16 dado. So there's two things that we want to hit here. I know that I want to be 1/8 of an inch deep into the wood, and I know that I want to hit my marking gauge line. And so the best way to dial in the depth on both of these pieces is using the controls of your table saw. So what you want to start by doing is dialing in the depth. And the best way to do this is set your saw blade just above the table, just so it's nicking the wood, and just slowly sneak up on it. Again, if you have something like a saw stop or any pretty decent cabinet saw, you should be able to sneak up on that depth. And so the way you go about setting up the fence is you have your marking gauge line, and you just want to set that to the closest tooth on the right side of the blade if you're setting it up the way that I'm working here. And so then once you have your piece in place, you want to bring your fence up close. But there's a very important thing when you're using your fence as a reference surface for doing this kind of stuff. You don't want your workpiece to be in contact with the fence when you're crossing over the blade. That creates a pinch point that can then cause kickback and is just generally not a good thing to do. And so what I've got mounted on the back side of my fence here is my Veritas planing stop, which is a nice thin piece of metal that I just clamp on. And you can see in the back here, I've just got a clamp holding it to the fence. And that creates a little bit of distance. I think that's about probably close to 1/4 of an inch distance between the fence and the workpiece when it's crossing over the blade. Okay, so now that we have all of our pieces prepped, we can start cutting our dovetails. So I always like to start with my tails. It depends on, who you learn from, what videos you watch online. Some people recommend starting with the tails, some people recommend starting with the pins. I personally like to start with the tails. And the tails, if you don't know what dovetails are the area that looks like a tail, looks like a bird's tail. And yeah, so that's what we're going to be starting with, which is on our side pieces. Now, it's really important when you're making dovetails that the tails of your dovetails are on the long section, or the area that's going to be getting pulled. And so one of the things I think is important to mention is that if you're making drawers for fine furniture, your only option is not to just use dovetails. You have a whole ton of other joints out there that are fully functional and would work just fine to make drawers. The reason most people use dovetails is just because they're such an interesting joint. Because to someone who's not a woodworker, who's never cut a dovetail before, it seems like a joint that shouldn't work. But as soon as you actually cut it as a woodworker, you really start to understand the complex geometry. But let's talk about some of the other options. First off, you could always do miters. If you just cut some simple miters and make a box that way, and so if you go with miters, you're going to need to reinforce it, otherwise they will break apart. Miters are a really weak joint, and especially in an application like this where you're going to be pulling on one end of them, they are going to break if you don't support them in some way. So you could easily put some keys in, or what's commonly referred to as splines, which are just pieces that would go across that miter. That's a good option. And so the other option with miters, you can also put some dowels in through the side. So you just have to make sure that they go in right into the corner and come into the front piece. That's going to create a ton of resistance and just a very strong joint in general, and will pretty much give you a seamless look on the front. Well, it will give you a seamless look on the front of your drawer. It'll look the same as our half-line dovetails are going to look. Another good option for drawer construction is box joints. So if you guys don't know what box joints are, they're those ones where they have the interlocking fingers that come together on all four corners, and that's a really cool look. Now, it's a look that I plan to do sometime in the future. I need to build a box joint jig because I really do like the look of box joints. But it's just a very kind of time-consuming and complex process to get together. I actually find that dovetails are a little bit more simple than getting good box joints because they take a lot more time to fit up and they can be a little bit more finicky, but they do look really good. And so the one downside to box joints for building drawers is that you're not going to be able to get a clean front face because obviously you have to have those joints pointing through. And so typically when people make drawers with box joints, you'll make a separate box with all your box joints on it. Then you'll attach a drawer front that'll be held on with some screws and that. And that's typically how you would build a drawer with box joints. Now, I personally really like the look of box joints, and someday when I actually take the time to build a proper jig or just buy one to make it it's a little bit simpler, I will actually make some drawers out of box joints with those exposed box joints on the front edge because it just looks cool. I personally really like when you have some joinery showing, but it does depend on the project. If you're building something with a ton of drawers and you have all these little box joints everywhere, it can look really busy and frantic. Whereas if you're building something small that has maybe one or two drawers in it and you have those simple areas of detail of the box joints, that can look really cool too. So it all just depends on your personal preference. Going down the list, you could just do a simple rabbet joint. So on these pieces, we do have these same rabbets. And so all you would do to do a rabbet joint is that you would basically do kind of what we have here, except you'd probably put the rabbet on the front end, and then you would just overlap them. And again, you're gonna need to put in like dowels or screws in through the side. Just that way there is something so that the drawer front, when you pull in the drawer front, it pulls the whole drawer along with it. And then lastly, there is the choice of using like pocket hole screws. Those are a way to build drawers, kind of frowned upon in the fine woodworking aspect of the world, but still a reasonable option. Okay, so on this so far, I've done a little bit of experimenting with the dovetails, just doing something I didn't initially plan to do, but I kind of figured now would be a good time to try it. So on our bottom three drawers, so the big one on the bottom and then the middle two that are the larger ones, I tried cutting the dovetails on the table saw, or at least the tails portion on the table saw. And so I really do like this method. I think it worked really well. I didn't have to make the gaps or the tails any wider than I normally would have because I normally have a 3/16 gap in between my tails. And because I have an 1/8 inch wide blade, it still works out just fine. So we have a little material left over to go in and clean up. but overall it's a very good, clean way of doing it. And so what I like about this is that the tails are just done. I have to go in and clean up the baseline with the chisel just because there's areas in there that the table saw can't get to because I'm just using a flat top grind blade. So there are little corners in that I have to clean up, and then these middle sections that I could have knocked out with the table saw blade, but I just didn't feel like doing it because I want to see how hard it is to clean those areas up with the chisel. But overall, the tails themselves are very clean. So one of the big issues I've had with dovetails is making sure that I keep my saw nice and straight. Because when you're tracking across a piece of wood with the saw, it's very easy for it to slightly skew to the left or the right, and then that can actually really mess up the fitting of your dovetail later on. I'm a little bit torn because part of me thinks that dovetails, if you can get really good with the handsaw, you can get a much better result, and it lets you do like big cases and big cabinetry and that out of dovetails, and it just has a little bit more freedom and opportunity to it. But the accuracy of the table saw is just kind of unbeatable in my opinion. And so with the table saw, it did take me a lot more time than I think it would with a little more practice, because this is my first time doing it. I was turning the table saw on and off again, making sure I got everything set up nicely. But I think that if I didn't have this rabbet on both sides, and I could see my marking lines all the way through, it'd be very easy to just hand hold this piece through, spin it around, hit the next line and all that. I think that would be a much easier way to work rather than setting up the stop block and hitting each piece.